Hi, it's Dwyer, dwyercrime.blog. Also, always 1776.com. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, let me just say before I get into the murder case involving accused Remy Ramsaran, right? Let me just say that I was a civil litigator before I became a professional negligence lawyer representing other lawyers accused of professional negligence, before I ended up being a family lawyer, right? So I have had over the years some civil clients who would come to me with requests that I represent them in meetings with the district attorney's office concerning possible criminal charges. And sometimes I would tell the client, hey, look, I'm just a civil lawyer. I don't know criminal law, which is a foreign country, right? But because they're a long-standing client, I would say, okay, I will sit next to you during the meeting with the district attorney's office, right? And let me be polite here. I've met some district attorney people. They're typically associate DAs. You also have the higher ranking assistant DAs. And they will be fishing. Folks, they will have nothing on my client. In other words, their case would literally rely on trying to get a confession from my client. And I would tell the client, hey, look, say nothing. Let me do most of the talking here. I would also tell my client, look, you need to, be prepared for them to leave the room. And you need to assume that the cameras are still rolling while we sit in this room together. And I don't want you saying anything. Right? Really, the purpose for agreeing to the meeting, from my standpoint, was just to find out what they thought they had on my client. That was it. Right? It wasn't to actually give information to the police. And if there was some reasonable request, right, then I could talk about it with my client after we've left the building, not in the room, to see if we could meet the cops halfway, right? Understand, attorney-client communications have a certain level of privilege, not perfect privilege, but they have a certain level of privilege that you can, talk candidly with your client and say, what's this about? Right? Smart attorneys will even say to their client, look, I don't want to know what actually happened. I just want to know what you can tell me that would help your defense in this case. Right? And typically, the clients I represented in these meetings with the DA's office, and it's less than 5, right? I'm not going to get into logistics here. Over years of being an attorney, typically, I'm only there after telling my client, you need a criminal lawyer. And they would say, Rich, can you do this for me? Can you? And I'd say, okay, fine, let me do this for you, right? Because I didn't want to risk losing them as a client in a civil case. Or as a repeat client, sometimes these people own businesses, right? Have different matters pop up. I've even been on retainer with some clients, right? So what I want to say here diplomatically to the public is that you have no idea, none whatsoever, about how often the district attorney has little evidence to solve a case and is just trying to intimidate someone who they think might be responsible for some crime, right? You see these TV shows and, you see that the tactics that cops use, that law enforcement uses, that the district attorney's office uses, are so heavy that innocent people sometimes give false confessions, right? You see these crime shows where it's one defendant and you have two cops or two law enforcement people or two district attorneys in the room with them trying to get information around a small table, and they're cutting off the person they suspect. They, are trying to hint at having evidence they don't have. Right? They have a big reveal moment where they tell you something. You need to realize that the district attorney's office can lie to you. Police can lie to you. There are cases in which someone's given a lie detector test. I would never agree to have any client of mine take a lie detector test. They're not admissible in court for a reason. Right? But cops will give you a lie detector test and then they'll say to you, you failed miserably. This test shows deception in an effort to get you to confess. Now, I want you to think of that because, in theory, our criminal justice system is based on the idea that you have to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's based on the idea that you can attend a criminal trial. The prosecution can put on their case, and if it's iffy, if you don't believe they've met their burden beyond a reasonable doubt, the defense can rest without calling any witnesses. You don't have a burden. You don't have to prove your innocence. Right? The prosecution, rather, has to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So I'm telling you that in the real world, particularly in these smaller towns, you'll have some awful crime take place that's unusual for the town. Right? Someone's gotten murdered. Right? There's a murderer in the area. And the press pressure is huge because murders don't happen in that area. Someone will have a motive, and that's different than evidence. Someone will have had a motive to do the murder. Right? Maybe the accused stood to inherit money from the person who got murdered. Maybe the accused was some disgruntled business partner of the murder victim. Maybe the murder victim was having an affair with the accused spouse. Right? There'll be some salacious motive and not much else. Now, I love shows like Dateline. It's one of my favorite shows. But understand, Dateline will trot out a prosecutor. And Dateline will ask these great TV-friendly questions. Right? Andrea Canning, and I'm a big fan. I think she does a great job getting people to talk. But Andrea Canning will have some prosecutor there. I need for you to think of the politics of this. And she will ask the question, and it sounds devastating on TV. Do you have any doubt in your mind that this accused did this terrible crime? Right? Murder, mayhem, kidnapping, whatever. Right? And the prosecutor will look at the camera And the prosecutor will say, no, I have no doubt. Let's pause the video right here and ask the question, what else can he possibly say? If he has filed murder charges against an accused, he knows his legal standard is to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So on camera, when asked whether he has doubt, since his office is behind the filing of murder charges, since his office accepted the legal burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the guy necessarily has to say on camera, no, I have no doubt in this person's guilt. If he doesn't, folks, there are things called a state bar that will step in and say, hey, whoa, wait a moment, player. You know your legal burden here. How could you, being the prosecutor, file a lawsuit against this accused if you yourself had doubts about their guilt? Understand, too, you have a civil side where the accused can say, man, this is ridiculous. The prosecutor had doubts. Yet he, filed murder charges against me, wrecking my reputation. Right? This is abusive. I've been defamed. I was detained in county or state facilities. I should get civil damages. So understand, Andrea Canning, as she does in the case I'm going to discuss here, has the prosecutor in front of her and says, do you have any doubt that this guy committed the crime? Of course the prosecutor says, no, I have no doubt. Right? I'm guessing there are many viewers who think that that's some kind of factual assertion. They're sitting there thinking, oh, this guy, if he was found not guilty, or if an appellate court threw out the conviction, this guy got away with murder. Let's talk about how big the legal burden is, too. Right? You need to understand that there's a distinct possibility. This is the way the system is theoretically set up, where you're a juror, you're hearing the evidence, and you're thinking to yourself, man, I think this guy did this crime. But you have doubts because there are gaps in the evidence. Right? You might even have doubts, as many did in the Karen Reed case, about the authenticity, the credibility of the police evidence. Right? You remember the OJ case. You had Furman using the N-word. He's the one who discovered the bloody glove. Right, folks? If you have any juror who says, man, I don't trust this guy. I don't trust the credibility of his discovery of the bloody glove. And, of course, all of this done without a search warrant. Right? If you find the police aren't credible, and if you start questioning the evidence they've collected, you could be in the jury and you could think, there is a possibility that OJ did this, whether or not the glove was planted. But you understand that the planted glove is part of the prosecution's presentation. And you might think to yourself, I can't trust the prosecution's presentation. I don't believe they've met the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now let's talk about Remy Ramsaran. This is an important case, right? But let's get uncomfortable here, because this is the United States of America. Let me tell you what happened recently. Military personnel were summoned to a meeting with the President of the United States and his Hegseth, the defense guy, in his cabinet. Right? And these military guys, and understand, To be high ranking in the military, you've had to provide exemplary service. Many of these guys have, received medals for act of bravery. You're out there. They've been on missions to places like Iraq. They have done acts of valor. Right? That's the group you're talking to. And understand, the purpose of the meeting was so Hegseth could talk about how there wouldn't be any more DEI. It's laughable, folks, to me at least. There wouldn't be any more DEI in the U.S. military. Now, shockingly, his comments received a cool response. Right? You can imagine some vet who, received medals for heroic acts in, combat, would be hearing this. You can imagine the governor of Maryland hearing this, combat veterans, and then suddenly having race brought into the conversation. Folks, race is that big a subject in the United States today. Well, I want people to just imagine a guy who is a Jack Johnson figure. Right? Jack Johnson, former heavyweight champ, too controversial, if you could believe this, for the first African American president of the United States to pardon. Even though at the time, the Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid, and the Republican nominee for the president, who went up against Barack Obama, John McCain, both supported the granting of a pardon for Jack Johnson. Right? Jack Johnson, of course, was convicted for violating the Mann Act because Jack Johnson was someone who had white girlfriends. Folks, that's still taboo in the United States. He was a black man who had white girlfriends, and he crossed state lines. Right? I'm not kidding here. Right? For those keeping track, Diddy was also charged under the Mann Act. Right? I'm hoping there comes a time in the United States where black members of Congress openly talk about how the Mann Act should be wiped off the books. Right? It's being misused. Well, here you have an Indian guy. And folks, understand, just like Jack Johnson had status, heavyweight champion, right? Understand, Johnson's so controversial that 20 years later, you had a guy whose nickname was the Brown Bomber. And his handlers told him, this is part of history, Joe Louis, his handlers told him, if you knock down a white guy, you can't linger over him. Right? That's 20 years after Jack Johnson. Right? Teddy Roosevelt was waiting to hear who won the fight that took place July 4th, 1910. And when he heard that it was Jack Johnson, not Jim Jeffries, who history has remembered as the Great White Hope, he slammed his hand on the table. Folks, Remy Ramsaran was a guy who was an IBM manager in New Berlin, New York, smaller town. Right, this is a guy who had status. He's married to a white woman with whom he has 3 kids. He is having an affair with her best friend, who's also a white woman. Right now, just understand how this whole thing falls out. Right? His personality is extroverted. He's a talker. He doesn't hide the fact that he's, involved with 2 different women as a married man. Right? The prosecutor in talking to Andrea Canning, actually tells her that one of the ways he knew this guy was guilty was from his statement to her that he, a married man, was living the perfect life. Right? This is a guy who, talks a lot, doesn't hide who he is, isn't self-censored. Right? He doesn't come across like a reserved politician. This isn't the Fortune 500 CEO persona. This isn't Bob Johnson. This isn't the political persona. This isn't Obama. This isn't Hakeem Jeffries. No, this is the minority who has a white-collar job, who is having an affair, who is openly giddy about it. Right? His defense, by the way, is simply, I did not kill my wife, who's the murder victim. So understand, the prosecutor says, I heard that line, and he wasn't acting like someone who didn't kill his wife. Right? In other words, you can't be someone talking about having had a perfect life when you just lost your wife and the police are investigating you for her murder. Forget the fact that he's talking in past tense. Right? Remy's argument is, why would I kill my wife? I'm with her. I'm with this other woman. I'm doing well in life. I have healthy kids. What's my motive? The world thinks his motive is he's having an affair. His argument is that many people have affairs. Very few of them kill their wives. Right? Understand, he's even more controversial than that. He now makes the claim that he, his wife, and his mistress were having threesomes. That he was having an affair with her best friend, with her permission. Well, what I'm going to do here, because this case is so ridiculous to me, it was brought without any evidence, is I'm going to, in the description of this YouTube video, I'm going to post a link to an NBC article, right, that talks about this crime. And what I want people to do is to focus heavily, and I mean focus heavily, on the body of his wife and on what the prosecution learned from looking at the body. Right? Just understand, he was supposed to be out jogging. She was supposed to be out shopping. This is New York. It's cold out. His wife's name is Jen. I'm going to read from this NBC News article. Right? Jen wasn't found for another 2 months when her remains were spotted at the bottom of a snowy embankment that had begun to thaw. Her body was so decomposed. Now, before I go further, just understand, the prosecution's burden is to prove not that she's dead, but that she was murdered. And not just that she was murdered, but that she was murdered by the accused, her husband Remy. Right? They found the body. We know she's dead. They now have to prove how she died and who's responsible. Let me start with the second paragraph again. Her body was so decomposed that medical officials were unable to determine exactly what killed her. The forensic pathologist later testified at trial, but her death was ruled a homicide. Folks, let me ask a simple question. How is that possible? If the forensic pathologist was unable to determine exactly what killed her, how could her death be ruled a homicide? On May 17, 2013, 6 months after Jen vanished, Remy was arrested on a charge of second-degree murder. Folks, let me just say, he should never have been arrested. I think they arrested him in the hopes that they could intimidate him into confessing. Right? I've been sitting, I've attended district attorney meetings with the client, and of course, the DA brings in multiple people. Right? We're sitting there, the two of us, and they bring in two people. Right? And they then start saying lines to you like, we know what happened. This is your opportunity to tell us what happened. We already have a good idea of what happened. Right? I had a client who was accused of embezzling from a company. I'm sitting there and they're putting on the show as if they don't need to talk to us. Right? Since it's embezzlement, one would have imagined they would already have checks. They would already have, a handwriting expert and stuff like that. I sat there, I watched the dog and pony show. I would have been more intimidated if they had one person. Or if they tried a good cop, bad cop type thing. No, they had two people in the room. They were trying to pressure her. Folks, she was never criminally charged. They had zero evidence. Zero. Right here, folks, how could they have any evidence against Remy? Any. Other than the fact that he's a minority, he was cheating on his wife, that gives him motive. He must be the person who killed her. Right? Think about it. The forensic pathologist, because the body was so decomposed, was unable to determine exactly what killed her. Folks, it's ridiculous. They don't know how she died. How are they going to prove to you that her husband's the one who killed her? Well, let's talk about the evidence. The alleged evidence. I would argue that the alleged evidence adds up to nothing. Right? They have a guy who's unpopular. They say 20% of the people around you privately resent you anyway. Right? This is the white-collar person of color who, is in an interracial marriage. And lo and behold, he's sleeping with another white woman. And of course, he feels he's living the perfect life. That's what he told Dateline. Right? At that time, he thought he was living the perfect life. Right? He had healthy kids. He had a wife who adored him. He had a mistress who adored him. He had a decent job. What's his motive? He's one lucky son of a gun. At least how he saw it. Folks, that doesn't play. That didn't play to an upstate New York jury. So let's look through the evidence, recognizing that this guy was actually found guilty. A verdict that the appellate court threw out. Right? First, they are making the claim that while the guy claimed he was out jogging after working earlier that morning, right, they're claiming that IBM records show that there was no computer activity from his home IP address that supported his claim that early that morning he was working on the computer. Right now, prosecutors don't question the fact that he does go outside jogging, but they want you to believe that he killed Jennifer at home. They have no evidence of that. He killed Jennifer at home, then dumped her body 20 miles away, ditching her iPhone in Plymouth, abandoning her minivan in Norwich. Right? That's their claim. Folks, they have no evidence to support any of that. Right? Then there's the cell phone and digital evidence. Right? Just understand, Jen's phone showed that she was playing an online fantasy game with her cyber friend Rob, who lived in England. Moments before, she suddenly stops playing the game. The idea is she's home and then someone abducts her. Right? Here's the problem. We don't know who abducted her. Right? This is the kind of thing that a DA's office will throw at someone they're investigating. Right? Okay. Maybe one theory is she's home, then she gets abducted. Who else had access to the home? Oh, her husband did. Right? But folks, you understand these home invasions, you have outsiders who could abduct her from her house. We now know, by the way, that there was DNA under a fingernail. In other words, there was up close and personal DNA belonging to some man other than Remy. We now know that, now that Remy has won his appeal. But just understand, the prosecution seems to feel that the fact that she was abducted at home necessarily means that Remy must have done it. Let's talk about the blood and DNA evidence. Folks, the prosecution now admits that a blood stain on Remy's shirt was inconclusive, that it's a mix of DNA. They now admit this. They now admit that it shouldn't have been showcased at trial like it was. Right, folks? That's the big evidence. On the Dateline, some cop says, look, I've been married and I don't have my wife's blood on any clothes. Right? Well, let me just say, there are people who do. Right? You're living with someone. Let's say you cuddle with your wife. Let's say she has a cut or whatever. Things happen. In any event, the prosecution now admits in this murder case that the blood and DNA evidence on Remy's shirt was inconclusive. So let me just say, looking through this file, and this video is interactive. You can disagree with me in the comment section. Please feel free to. Looking at this trial, basically what they have is a husband having an affair and a body they discover months later that's decomposed. They can't even tell you how the victim was killed. So Dateline milks it. Right? In the Dana Chandler case, and I'm still stunned that they got a conviction in that case, they had the accused daughter, right, speculating, because she doesn't know, on her mom's guilt. Right? That's, in the Dateline episode here, they have no smoking gun. They have speculation that a guy who's having an affair, if you want to call it an affair, right? Because if he's being completely truthful, he's sleeping with both women with both of their knowledges. He's actually having threesomes with them, right? But they have his mistress speculating on Dateline that because he didn't want to have sex with her the day of the murder, maybe that means that his mind was on other things and that he killed his wife that day. Right, folks? It doesn't make sense. You know, you have country songs. I'm a divorce lawyer now. You have country songs where they say, in cases not involving threesomes, it's cheaper to keep her. Right? Let me just say, you have many guys. JFK, President of the United States, having an affair on his wife, but yet he didn't want a divorce. Right? He, from what we can tell, loved his wife, loved having her by his side, loved having her known publicly as his wife, dies with her sitting next to him in the limousine. Right, folks? All the prosecution has here is a guy having an affair, who, of course, is an unsympathetic person of color in an interracial marriage, right? Having an affair with yet another white woman and being caught on camera on Dateline saying at that time he was living the perfect life. He didn't have a motive to kill anyone. Right? And of course, the prosecution has no evidence that he ever killed anyone before. Right? None whatsoever. So let me tell you what happened. This guy's family paid over $100,000 to his attorney, who had very little criminal law experience. And in the case that he handled in criminal law, he recused himself. He withdrew from the case because he felt he wasn't qualified enough. So here he is in his first murder case. And what does he do? In a case involving a corpse that the forensic pathologist admits they can't determine the cause of death. Right? Think about that. Right? In a case where everyone knows that the accused was cheating on his wife. This attorney, with very little experience, puts his Jack Johnson, personality-wise, client on the stand. So, of course, you have a client on the stand who is not remorseful about having an affair. Right? His defense is that he didn't do it. So, of course, the prosecution's able to then cross-examine him about the fact that he was cheating on his wife, playing up the idea that he had a motive. Right? The conviction gets thrown out based on ineffective assistance of counsel. Right? More importantly, folks, understand there's no evidence. He had an affair. His wife's body was found months later. They can't determine the cause of death. They can't determine how she died. There's no case to build here. He doesn't have the legal burden. The prosecution has the burden. Let me say, too, that in a case where the forensic pathologist doesn't know how she died, Remy's wife, you would have thought that his own attorney would have highlighted that fact by retaining his own forensic pathologist, by talking about the fact that the body leaves things wide open. You would have thought, too, that his own attorney would have thought, you know what? Let's analyze the DNA under her nails. And let's highlight the fact that some unknown man's DNA is under her nails. You don't get that by touch. Right? If it's under your nail, that means there's some scratching. Let me also say, too, they find his DNA on a body that wasn't discovered for months. Who knows how rich the DNA source was the day she got murdered? Remy's attorney did none of that. Right? I'm not kidding when I say that, a client who wants me to sit in with them before a DA really needs to convince me to do so. Because I don't feel I have the criminal law experience. That's a foreign country. Right? The law has many foreign parts. Right? I'm a family lawyer because I had litigation clients who wanted me to handle their, spousal support, child support, divorces. I got talked into that. Right? Ended up learning, doing, but in those cases, I told my clients, I said, look, I'll represent you in this divorce, but you need to understand I don't have the experience. Here, some professional organization, I believe it's the State Bar, censored Remy's attorney for misrepresenting to his family who hired him his level of criminal law experience. Right? They thought he was going to challenge the cell phone evidence, right? Because, of course, the victim's body is found miles away from where Remy and her lived. Right? Remy's family thought that his attorney would point out that Remy's cell phone wasn't in that area. He couldn't have been the person who dumped the body. Understand the prosecution theory of the case as him killing her at home and then transporting her with her vehicle to different locations miles away from home. He's supposed to have done the crime himself. This is not a murder for hire theory because they don't have any evidence of that at all. I would argue they don't have any evidence that Remy murdered his wife. You know what I think happened, right? And this is opinion. I think he's in, some upstate New York, smaller town. This terrible crime took place. There's political pressure on the prosecutor's office. People around knew he was having an affair. Right? They then thought, you know what? He must have done this. Many people suspected he did this. The prosecution expected or suspected that he did this. Right? He didn't confess. That surprised them. They looked into the forensic evidence. It wasn't convincing. They then started getting granular on what he said he did that day. And they then found some inconsistencies, right? He says he was working on the computer and there's no evidence of that. Right? They thought, hey, he's not being completely truthful to us. Folks, my point to you is there's a huge jump between that reality and proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If the body's so decomposed that you don't know how the person died, I would argue you don't have a case. If you're a juror in this case, and the forensic pathologist is telling you that they don't know how the person died, you're being asked to speculate. And with the legal burden being proof beyond a reasonable doubt, I would argue there's no room for speculation by a jury in a criminal murder case. right? This isn't even a civil wrongful death case. This is a criminal murder case. So Remy, of course, gets a new trial. Rather than go through the new trial, because he's been in prison, right, he realizes, hey, since I have some time served, let me accept the plea deal for manslaughter. Right? The prosecution realized they don't have the evidence here to show second-degree murder. So Remy, who continues to this day to claim his innocence, says that he accepted the plea deal because it means he'll get out of prison in, under 10 years, total sentence. Right? In other words, he got 22 years. That's a political thing. Just understand that with time served and good behavior incentives, he should be out in less than 9 years, total time served. Right, folks? Even the 9 years from this seat's too much. But these are the deals people have to cut when they realize that they've been convicted on a paucity of evidence in a case where the forensic pathologist can't even tell you how the victim died. Can't even tell you the cause of death. Right? Remy, of course, married man, having an affair, is on Dateline. He says, hey, I was living the perfect life. Why would I kill anyone? The prosecutor thought that statement was major. Folks, that statement that statement doesn't show guilt at all. That statement doesn't show cause of death. You don't even know how he transported the murder victim to where her body was found, if it was him. As I've said, the legal burden is so high that you could be a juror in a case like this. And you could think to yourself, man, I think this guy did it, and still vote not guilty because the prosecution didn't meet their burden. As a juror, you have to think that it's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're sitting there going off gut feeling, you have to vote not guilty because the legal burden has not been met. Folks, the name of the Dateline episode is The Perfect Life. Right? This is the kind of title they give a minority defendant who is happy to have a good paying job, healthy children, and who's involved in an interracial relationship as well as an extramarital affair, both with white women. Right? We're supposed to be outraged. This person of color thought he was living the perfect life while cheating on his wife. Right? American society can't handle having more than one lover. Right? I can't even call it polygamy. Right? Let's just say polyamory. Right? They've always had a problem with people who have more than one wife, even though you have cultures that have led to TV shows where folks are talking about sister wives. Right? Somehow our government wants to get involved in adult consensual relationships. I understand the pressure mistresses feel when they're outed, right? You're having an affair with someone whose wife gets murdered. Right? Suddenly you're the mistress, and I understand there's heavy pressure to say, gee, he might have done it. Right? Folks, this case should never have been bought. Never. Right? Let me just say, it's only because the accused is not remorseful that he isn't viewed as sympathetic. Right? He's in prison for a crime if it's a crime, in which his wife was murdered in such a way that the forensic pathologist can't testify as to how she was killed, if she was killed. That's preposterous. Those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.